So I started making this video maybe 3 months or so ago. I was a little more shaven, a little less cut, and I just procrastinated a bunch. So I am trying to wrap this up today because I think it's useful. The idea I wanted to tackle is basically to create an instrument that's super accessible, something very simple, like anybody can look at, see what's going on, and have it be available for as many platforms as possible. I'm gonna pop in a few more times with these future cuts just in case what I said I either felt like was inadequate, or if I just have like hindsight that I think is valuable to the conversation. So without further ado, here. My goal is creating a sampler instrument for as many platforms as possible, which means having to learn some of them for the first time. The instrument I have is this little master key. It's kind of like a harmonica for every key. It's got a little pitch for every note with a chromatic scale from F to F. The goal is we're going to sample each note of this thing just once. Extend the key ranges to fit the entire keyboard. So you've got like a super master key. I've got a pretty good idea of what I'm doing, but I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, so let's just dive in. So the noise gate on this part when I originally recorded was terrible. So I'm just going to speed it up super fast so you can kind of see what happens, but I basically just sampled every note and then started cutting them up. Voiceover time. So now that all those samples have been recorded, it's time to start cutting them up. So we're doing that. We're adding fades to each one, both at the beginning and the end. Much longer ones at the end, but the beginning just to stop that like DC offset click stuff. Each track, or I should say each note and microphone gets its own track pair combination. So it's just easier to export and name all the stuff as we go. Now we're just doing a little bit of treatment on the files just to make sure that they sound good before we export and put them into Kontakt, and they're ready to go. So this next part is just going to be optimizing the instrument in Kontakt. We have everything mapped where it needs to go, but we're going to go in and start working on those sample points. Where does it start? Where does it end? Where does it loop start? Where does the loop end? Etc. Once we have that figured out and feeling good under the fingers, we're going to write that down in a text editor of our choice, and then we're going to use that to basically take what we have in Kontakt and just bring it to every other instrument we're going to use. So as you can see here, we start doing that. Everything in, awesome. Now we're doing EXS. So we're just taking all of those sample points and just literally loading the zones right on in, just as they were in Kontakt, and just using that info we already had. Here you can see we're doing the same thing with the Ableton sampler. This one gave me so much trouble in that I would put in the exact values and it would seem like it was working perfectly fine, but then it would play completely differently from every other sampler. I don't know why, but eventually we got it and it worked. Next up was DirectWave. This one wasn't so bad, I just pretty much imported the instrument and it worked. I had to tweak with the samples a little bit. And sample precision was kind of hard to figure out, but it wasn't nearly as much of a headache as the Ableton sampler was in that regard, so good job, ImageLine team, on that. Beyond that, not too much else to say. Moving on, the next one up is going to be Decent Sampler. I actually really didn't mind working with Decent Sampler other than you have to do it all via text editor. I wish there was a graphical component to make this happen a lot faster. Hopefully that's on the way, but overall, learning it was very quick for me and pretty straightforward, and the documentation's actually really decent. I guess that's in the name, Decent Sampler. So thank you, David Hilowitz, for that, and having this be something that is at least a good conversation starting point for what we should expect in the sampling community, and just a nice alternative to using sound fonts. It's a little more modern, friendlier for first-timers, and truthfully not as bad as I was expecting it to be. Next up is SFZ. I kind of cheated here and used a tool that could convert EXS instruments to the SFZ format. However, that is honestly a valid strategy of doing it if you want to make your instruments more accessible. But as far as I can tell from reading documentation, creating them for SFZ isn't all that bad either, and hopefully somewhat comparable to Decent Sampler. Next up is TX16WX. This thing was a little bit weird and buggy for me, but same thing, I just sort of imported what I had and it worked, and eventually got it and it was okay. And last up is highs. I did not enjoy working with highs. It felt like there was a lot of power behind it, but it was very confusing, and again, it was a little bit buggy for me. Overall, it felt very unfriendly for the beginner. It's nice that you could export it as like a plugin, but this would definitely not be the first thing I recommend. Okay, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I did 8. I know that there are more formats out there than that, but I think these are some of the most accessible ones people will have access to. I also know I didn't spend a whole lot of time on each one, but this isn't really meant to be as comprehensive as it is kind of like getting your hands wet and seeing what the whole process is like. I encourage all questions and discussion. If you thought this was helpful, go ahead and smash all of the buttons and bells, and I will be seeing you